Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Masira webinar on who is monitoring the children's internet. My name is Luke Harris, and I'm a media officer with the Media Centre for Education Research Australia. Before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, Masira acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. For myself, that is the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains region, and that we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This meeting will be recorded and available to our Masira subscribers. I do acknowledge that maybe some of you here today that are not from our subscribing partners, which we do welcome. And if this is you, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about Masira and what we do, we have our General Manager, Bindi Taylor, who can answer some questions directly. We also have our Media Officer, Brendan Deppenmore, present, who will be moderating this webinar, and he will also be able to assist with questions. The internet and online spaces have long been considered a bit of a wild west. For many years, general access to online spaces has remained unrestricted, with little oversight in regard to the suitability of material that's being accessed by children or those who are underage, with parental controls being one of the only factors kind of determining the children's access to the internet. To combat this free-for-all which currently exists, a 2-year project undertaken by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child has recently culminated in the publication of a manifesto for a better children's internet, highlighting 17 actionable principles towards creating a better, safer internet for children, including the development of quality standards for age-appropriate content, a move away from over-reliance of parental control, and promotion of media literacy. To facilitate and help better understand what this manifesto of practical principles for redesigning the internet with children at front of mind, Masira has teamed up with leading experts from the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child, including experts who work directly on this report, to discuss ways in which we can create a better children's internet for the future. Our first speaker today is Professor Michael Dezuani from the Queensland University of Technology. Michael is the program leader for digital inclusion and participation for QUT's Digital Research Centre, as well as chief investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child and project lead behind the manifesto for a better children's internet. His research focuses on digital literacy and learning through the use of digital games in the classroom. Michael will be discussing the broad background to the project, including the need for a focus on children's internet. Following Michael, we have Dr. Alicia Rodriguez, also from the Queensland University of Technology. Alicia, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child and another project lead behind the manifesto for a better children's internet. They are a researcher in the fields of digital media, communication, and science and technology studies, particularly on public communication and platforms such as TikTok and Reddit. They will be sharing how the team approached this project, including consultation with industry, as well as outlining some of the key principles the team developed for a better children's internet. Our last speaker today is Professor Tamer Levy. Tamer is an academic in the field of internet studies at Curtin University and the chief investigator at the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. He is a recognized expert in online communication and media with specific interests in social media, big data, privacy, surveillance, and agency, mobile gaming, and the changing landscape of media distribution. He will be speaking about the child influences and the challenges of generative artificial intelligence systems. Each speaker will have around 8 to 10 minutes of speaking time, followed by a Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you would like to ask any questions during the webinar, please post any questions that you have in the chat, either during the speeches or after the speeches, and I'll ask them at the end of the webinar. Without any further ado, I will bring Michael onto the stage. Michael?
Thank you so much, Luke. It's really terrific to be here today, and thank you for giving us the time to talk about our project, which we're really excited about and which we hope will make a difference to children's experiences of the internet. I'm just going to ask Alicia to start sharing our slides here. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara, and acknowledge that they're the First Nations owners of the lands where we're meeting today, and recognise that these have always been places of teaching, learning and research as well. And just recognise that these remain unceded lands. So we first came up with this project for a better children's internet, because I think we recognise that, well, we all recognise that children are on the internet in very large numbers. We know that on platforms like YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, there are many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children around the world who are using these platforms on a daily basis. But in addition to that, we also know that the internet more generally is just a constant presence in children's lives. And I'll talk a little bit later about the kinds of various ways in which children have touch points with the internet throughout their daily lives. We know that a lot of the focus on children and the internet has been on well-being and on concepts like screen time. And, you know, those have been the main kinds of frameworks through which we've been encouraged to think about children's experience of digital technologies. But when we began this project, we really wanted to recognise that if we just focus on frameworks like well-being and screen time, that actually limits us in terms of the kind of focus that we can have and the sorts of solutions that we might have for creating a better children's internet. So if we focus on screen time, for instance, in a way, the only kind of solution to too much screen time is to restrict screen time and to say, well, what's the right amount of time a child should be on a screen each day? And, you know, there's a kind of solution around that, and perhaps there is a magic number, perhaps. But in a way, that's a fairly narrow way of thinking about children's experiences of technology. And likewise, although of course a concept like well-being is incredibly important, and we do want children to have positive experiences and to experience or to have opportunities that are positive for their mental health and so on. Again, if that's the only way that we're thinking about children and the internet, we end up with a quite restricted set of guidelines for how we might make improvements. So for this project, we wanted to think about the broader industries sitting around the children's internet. We wanted to think about the various people who make products for the children's internet, and how they make those available to children, what's motivating them to make products for children in the first place, and then what kinds of guidelines or regulations kind of sit around that. So we take what we call a political economy approach in this project. So we're interested in kind of following the money and the power, if you like, and we think that this opens up a range of new possibilities for thinking about the children and the internet. And later on, Alicia will talk about some of the principles that we've come up with that reflect this kind of broader focus as well. Before I kind of get into talking just a little bit more about how we've approached this, I'd like to acknowledge that this project's actually one that has been, oh, Alicia's just lost the slides there. This project has actually been undertaken by a very large team from the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. So you can see on the screen there, there's a list of about 17 names. So these are folks from not just QUT here, but from the Deakin node of the Centre of Excellence, the Curtin node of the Centre of Excellence, the Wollongong node as well. So we've we've also got international partners who are part of this. And then as we've undertaken this project, we've also talked to some key people who are very knowledgeable about children and the internet. And I won't go through all of those names, but I'll pick out a couple. So we've spoken to David Kleeman, for instance, who is a very well-known person in the children's digital media and entertainment space, and is currently Senior Vice President of Global Trends for Dubbit, and they're currently making lots of content for the digital platform Roblox, for example. And we spoke to Kate McQuillan, who is the creator of and producer of shows like Get Grubby TV and Dirt Girl World. And so we wanted to speak to these people because we wanted to get their perspectives on what would make a better experience for children on the internet. So let me turn now to what we mean about this idea of children and the internet. And so in our report, we have this figure which talks about a day in the life of a child in relation to the internet. And I certainly won't try to cover off on all of these, but and I appreciate the text is a little small on the screen there. But what we've tried to do here is to give that sense that for a kind of teched up middle-class child, they're kind of constantly in contact with the internet throughout their day. So they might be woken up by an alarm on a phone or an iPad that is connected to the internet. Then, you know, if they wake up early before the rest of the house is kind of up and about, they might already be watching some videos on YouTube, for instance, or might even be messaging their friends on an app like Facebook Messenger. They probably have a tablet computer that they're taking to school. And so once they get to school, they're already, getting their iPad out before they get to class, and kind of doing entertainment-based stuff with their friends on their iPad. When they get into class, then they're doing stuff around ed tech platforms and learning through maybe a digital gaming platform or something like that. And this just goes on throughout the day, right? So we know that, once kids get home after school, they're very likely to be on YouTube, watching YouTube entertainers. They may be, watching Netflix with their family. They might have a VR headset that they use for half an hour in the evening. And then again, when they're going to bed in the evening, it might be that they go to sleep listening to a Spotify playlist or something like that. So just as all of us experience the internet throughout our daily lives, children are definitely experiencing a very vast range of technologies throughout their day. We did also, we're very careful in the report to say that, of course, not all children have this opportunity. So digital inclusion and exclusion is still very much a reality for many Australian children. We know that that low-income families, for instance, still have inconsistent access to the internet or a much poorer quality of access to the internet than middle-class families do. And so we're not suggesting that this is every child's experience, but certainly, as I said, for teched up kids, this is the experience for many of them today. So then what do we do about this? Like, how do we think about all of this? Well, we took our inspiration from this history of thinking about children's television. So you may know that over the past 30, 40, 50 years or so, we've talked about children's television. And we've talked about that not just in terms of kind of the products that are available or the specific TV shows that are available for children. We've also talked about it in terms of who produces children's television, what regulations sit around children's television. Should children's television be entertaining, or should it also be educational and learning based? What opportunities do children have to kind of participate in learning to make their own media and participating with their own media and so on? We've been talking about that kind of thing for a long time in relation to children's TV. So we wanted to think about this in relation to the internet. And so in our report, we have 6 sections, and the first section talks about access to products and services and the kinds of things children are likely to be doing online. We have this section that focuses on imaginaries, which is all about the kinds of lenses we place on thinking about children's experiences of technology. So we have an imaginary that maybe technology is a force for good in society, or that we need it for innovation, as opposed to a different imaginary, which might be that the internet is a frightening and scary place. So we try to canvass the different kinds of stories we tell in our society about the children's internet. The 2 middle sections focus on entertainment and then education and learning. And so we look at the various kinds of educational products and so on, or the ed tech products that are available for kids to learn And we also look at the ways in which entertainment now is kind of carved up across these transmedia platforms. So we still have TV that exists, of course, but increasingly we have digital platforms as well where children are being entertained. We have a section on regulation and policy and thinking through, well, what should be done? What kinds of rules and regulations should we have to regulate the children's internet? And then the final section focuses on how children themselves are making the children's internet by participating through making user-generated content for platforms and so on. And Tama's going to pick up on this a little bit later on, where he talks about child influences and so on. All right, I'm going to hand over to Alicia now, who's going to talk a bit more about how we went about this project and kind of the processes we went through. And they are also going to talk about the principles that we have developed to put out there into the world to suggest, here's what we think should happen to make a better children's internet.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So firstly, this question of like, why a manifesto for a better children's internet? And through this process, talking with the team, we came to the conclusion that it's important to be aspirational when it comes to doing this research and putting this document out there, that it's time to declare that the children's internet exists, and that to also declare that a better children's internet is possible. And hence why we have these 17 actionable principles calling upon government, industry, families, educators, advocates, and everyone, wider society, to strive towards a better children's internet. So as Michael explained earlier, we've taken a political economy approach. And as he described, that's looking at both following the power and money. And we've taken that approach in terms of thinking about the ways in which the children's internet is commercialized, but also looking at public funding models as well. So just understanding the context in which the wide variety of digital product, services, and content access, the ways in which it's produced. And so this political economy approach trickles through all of the different research methods that we employed. And so we first started off by running consultation workshops with the wider research team, which is comprised of 17 researchers at the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. And through these multiple workshops, it's about teasing out and leaning on the incredible expertise that these researchers have to first conceptualize what Michael was describing around these 6 lenses and thinking about the children's internet. And so based on these consultations, we then sought out key experts, both international experts in the areas of children's digital media, as Michael pointed to again at the start of listing the folks that we interviewed. And so in these interviews, we were asking questions around the types of digital media products, services, and content that they produce or have been part of producing, and asking them about what types of global trends, what types of trends are they seeing that are problematic in the area of the children's internet, but also what are the trends that they are seeing that are hopeful, that they think that there needs to be more of. Questions around the ways the regulation of the children's internet, their awareness around those things. And so that produced a rich data set and understanding for us to be able to build this document. And following on from, or in conjunction with running these consultations and interviews, we mapped the various digital product services available to the children's internet. And so to give an example of it, in our entertainment chapter, we take the example of Encanto, and we map the way that this franchise appears in different digital media, whether it's the films and games, the different digital devices. And so what it does by mapping these products and services, it teases out the really complex landscape that, for example, a family, their child might really be into Encanto. And as a family, you want to support your child's enthusiasm for this brand. And so just pointing to the various types of digital media that you need to be across in order to create this Encanto ecosystem within your home. So in doing all these different research methods, we've devised the manifesto, as well as come up with these 17 principles. Now, I don't have enough time to go through all 17 principles, so what I'll just do is highlight a couple of them, and I highly encourage you to check out the document to see the others. So firstly, we call upon the availability of free and high quality children's internet experiences. So recognizing that that children, like every child, should have access to a better children's internet, and that of that free access, it needs to be of high quality. And so following on from that, the second principle calls that in order to have this high quality free children's internet experiences, we need to have the development of quality standards for age appropriate entertainment and educational products and services for children. Continuing along, fourth principle is saying that we need to have less focus on protecting children from the digital environment and more focus on protecting them within. And that's a really important key distinction of, so rather than saying that, as Michael's describing around at the start around screen time, and that if we follow the ideas of saying that screen time is bad, it constructs this idea that, well, the only solution then is to just say, well, children shouldn't have access. And that isn't realistic, nor is it productive for children to have better internet experiences. And so this is why we're calling upon, it's about protecting children within the digital environment they find themselves in. Principle number 6 is the saying that we're calling for more investment in locally produced, diverse, and high quality entertainment and educational products and services for children and families. And so this principle also flows into this very first principle of saying that the availability of free and high quality children's internet experiences, and saying that this investment is not just something that needs to come from commercialized spaces. This is also something that should be funded publicly as well, because it is a public good. Continuing along, we have a principle 8, saying that avoiding the tech entrepreneurial philosophy of move fast and break things when developing products and services for children. So with this one, this idea of move fast and break things is the ethos that drives a lot of Silicon Valley-based development. So things like Facebook and Instagram, a lot of digital products will be in the name of innovation. Things will be created quickly, deployed to the public, and essentially tested on the public to see if this works or not. And then feedback is given, and then the digital product is refined and fine-tuned to that community or that audience. Now, when it comes in the context of children, that's no longer appropriate. It's not appropriate to move fast and break things when it comes to children's high quality experiences. And so what we're saying within this principle is that we need to have more carefully considered approaches when it comes to the development of the digital products, services, and content that children will use. Principle number 12, which I think will be highly relevant to this audience, is that we're calling for better quality control of products and services that are labeled as educational within major app stores. And this is a principle that is pointing to this idea that, just along with principle 8, and that there's this kind of ethos of developing products and services quickly to push to market. Sometimes these products and services that are pushed to market that are labeled as educational may not have any or very little educational quality. And so what we're calling for is that we need to have some type of quality controls in place, so that when families or educators are making a decision around this app or this digital resource is appropriate, there needs to be some type of standard there so that they can make that judgment call, and greater scrutiny so that folks can't just label things educational to make a quick buck. So moving on to principle 14, we're calling for a move away from the over-reliance on parental controls as the solution to managing or improving children's online experiences. So right now, where it kind of currently stands with a lot of digital products and services is that they're deployed, and it might be an app. So for example, let's say TikTok, like the app exists, and if the child is under 18 but above 13, they're able to use the app, but a parent is able to kind of monitor it through parental controls. And so a lot of tech companies will then kind of sit back and say, well, look, we've done our job. It's safe for children because we're allowing parents to kind of do this, that, and other to kind of monitor the child's experience. But what we're saying is that one, not enough, and two, it burdens families or parents to be doing that labor when actually having enjoyable, safe experiences for children online is a wider societal thing. It's something that governments and industry and the tech companies need to also have some responsibility for and of. So that's why we're calling for a move away from the over-reliance of parental controls. Number 16, we're calling for legislation to ensure the recognition and protection of children's digital labor. And so this relates particularly to this last lens of the last chapter of the manifesto, which talks about digital participation and recognizing that children are co-creators of the children's internet. And so it's important that children are online, that they are engaging in user-generated content. But it's important that their labor is that there's a recognition and protection of it, maybe similar in the ways in which we think about children's labor is protected in the film and TV industry. And so lastly, our last principle that we draw attention to is the promotion of media literacy to support children's fun, productive, safe, diverse, and ethical internet experiences. And with this principle, with media literacy feeds into all of these different lenses and all amongst these, like in amongst all of these principles. And this media literacy is not just for the children themselves, it's for parents, families, educators. Everyone needs to be involved in seeing media literacy as a lifelong skill and something that is constantly needs to be worked on in order for children to have really enjoyable experiences online. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Tama.
Thanks, Alicia. So I'm going to maybe just pick up on the one example that I'm conscious of time a little bit, and just talk a little bit about how child influencers encapsulate some of the things that we've talked about in the white paper, but also some of the complexity where this is not a clear-cut space either. So if you're not familiar, child influencers are basically children who appear in either their own or family-generated content, sometimes on a very specific topic. So we might have a child influencer who talks about Minecraft or about gaming or about some other sort of experience, or we might have child influencers who are more generally promoting different lifestyle products, things like that. Sometimes they emerge from families. So we have sort of family influences where the child starts as part of the story of the family and then might spin up to be the main event. Or we have children who are styled as influencers from often incredibly early in their life. Now, depending on when they start, you get sort of different sorts of questions around agency, around choice, whether whether this is a fun and healthy part of a family, or whether what's the line? Where does it cross into being something that's perhaps more labor and less fun? And can it just be fun to start with? And I think there's probably, there's a really difficult thing when we use the political economy lens, is trying to map where fun is also a tricky thing in this space. But we know that fun exists, and it's important to see fun as something that's really important. And I think the sort of the manifesto really recognizes that fun is part of what children are online for. But with child influencers, then we have that sort of tricky space where one of the interesting things about the report is we sort of took children's television as the sort of aspiration in a way to start with. But those same sort of rules, even though internet content works in a similar way, haven't translated. So we have rules around children's labor, for example, on television, which are incredibly clear. We know exactly how long kids can work in a particular setting, where the money can go, who's in charge of it, and what the relationship between producers, parents, and children as performers, if you like, is. On the internet, because the space where social turns into work, turns into media, is incredibly unclear. So what's the difference between a child appearing in a parent's Instagram photo? So we have sort of that space of sharing through to, children suddenly appearing in their own videos for fun, through to, children appearing in videos where there's suddenly promotional content, where there's actually some sort of exchange of money in the background where a particular product or experience or something else is being promoted. And working out the lines around that is very, very tricky. And I think something that, that this manifesto sort of says, we want to think about those spaces. We want to think about children having good experiences, but we also want to think about children's labor not being something that's a presumption that even parents should be in charge of. So that having broader guidelines, broader guardrails, if you like, is something that we want to see in this space, because it will give sort of a minimum standard for people to think through. I think one of the trickiest things in this space is that parents are both being the caregiver, but also often the producer or the manager. And that's a really tricky balance to strike, because you're serving two quite different needs. And I think while perhaps not as much the case in Australia, certainly when we've looked at this globally, we see sometimes in families that are moving out of, say, abject poverty, a child can become the primary breadwinner for the family. And that's a really difficult situation. In some ways, it's really good that there is a pathway out of abject poverty. But at the same time, if the family's well-being is suddenly the responsibility of a 5-year-old, that's a really significant burden to carry. So I think rather than saying that there's good or bad in this space, what we can say is it epitomizes the challenges in mapping this space, understanding it, why having some principles to work from is so incredibly important. So being conscious of time, I might just stop there and have that example on the table, and then we can throw to questions and see what else people would actually like to hear about, considering we've got a good 100 pages to draw on there.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much to the three of you for presenting today on that one. Now, I will start off with a couple of questions. Keep in mind, if anyone in the audience does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will ask them accordingly. I'm actually going to start with you, Timer, while I've got you here. You're talking about child influence and how they can often influence their consumers. Essentially, children are very easily influenced. And if a child is watching a child influencer, they might also be influenced to follow a similar career path. However, whilst becoming an influencer can sometimes be viable, most often it's not going to be a viable career path for, I'd say, 99% as an assumption of those who want to follow that career path. We also talk about we hear about industry plants, which are sort of influencers which are manufactured by companies to essentially promote their product or promote a way of thinking. Are child influencers setting other children up for failure in the future?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. I think what we've seen a lot of conversation around that. There was a report, I think, that said more children aspired to be influencers than astronauts or something of that nature. And it was this sort of big media tears where it's like, oh my God, the children of today, their aspirations are terrible now. The idea of being I was one of those kids that desperately wanted to be an astronaut. And I've got to tell you, it wasn't realistic then. And it's certainly not realistic now. But the aspiration, the idea of being interested in space, about reading about travel, the idea about reading about what NASA did, about reading about the planets, that was a useful part of that process for me. And I think in the same way, I don't think most kids are going to grow up to be influencers, but the things that they learn, the literacies that they develop about aspiring to that, and think about, how do I record a video? How do I sound like I know what I'm talking about when I look into a camera? How do I hold myself? How do I do some research so I can talk about a thing and sound credible? These sort of skills are really important. So I don't think that this generation is missing out by having aspiration. I don't think this is a tragedy of the internet. I actually think we see every generation adapt to listening and aspiring in different ways. And children listening to their peers, I think, might be one of the newer things here. But children have always listened to children, whether it's on television or radio or beyond. They inspire each other, perhaps in a way that adults don't quite resonate in the same way. And I think that's a really healthy thing. But I also think having some, as we said, some spaces around influencers where, as that becomes a viable career, there are some guardrails that will be helpful too.
Would you say that also helps towards, building a children's imagination as well?
Oh, of course. Any engagement where you aspire to do something, and my 6-year-old can grab the phone and make a little video that she says to her parents that sounds professionally produced. She does a little intro. She talks about her day. It's really great fun, and I think those are actually really helpful skills that will assist her in life. But I don't think anything's being lost in that process. So as much as it's important to have certain boundaries, I think for the most part, these sort of aspirations are about building literacy more than anything else.
Lovely. Michael, now you spoke about digital accessibility when you were speaking, and you specifically mentioned that some low and some mid-income families don't have full access to the internet. Is there a solution to this, and what is the solution? How can we enable accessible internet for all, essentially?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. It's a really good question. So this is actually something that has been looked at closely by the federal government in recent times, and particularly coming out of COVID, I guess, for instance, because we know that during COVID, these inequalities related to accessing the internet were really highlighted. So we know that, of course, low-income kids prior to COVID didn't have access, and now that COVID's kind of gone, that those same kids still don't have access. But during that COVID period, it was brought into stark relief that certain kids just couldn't access schooling because they didn't have a stable internet connection at home, or even if they did have some kind of internet connection, they didn't necessarily have a device on which to be able to appropriately do schoolwork or to jump on a Teams call or whatever the case might be. So there's a couple of solutions to this. So there are a number of national charities and organisations that are very aware of this and that are currently trying to provision options for being connected and having access to devices. So the Smith family, for instance, is doing a terrific job. They have a campaign currently out that says that if you're not digitally connected, then you're highly disadvantaged. The federal government itself currently has a student broadband initiative where initially, at least, they have said that they're keen to connect up to 20,000 low-income families to connect them to the NBN and provide them with appropriate devices as well. So there are these efforts to improve the situation. Of course, despite all of those efforts, there will still be some kids that are just left behind. We know that in this space that you have intersecting disadvantages as well. So obviously, if you're a homeless family, it's very difficult to connect you up to an NBN connection, as an example, right? So I think we just do need to be aware that there are things we can do. There are definitely positive steps that we can make, but there are always likely to be some people who will continue to be disconnected.
Another question for either yourself or Alicia here. Now, I think Alicia mentioned that there's some content which is being poised as educational, where in fact it has no educational content or very little educational content. My observation would be that the line can often be quite blurred between what is education and learning. Is it a good thing that this line is blurred, that we're maybe sort of, having children that are consuming content which is that they think is sort of entertainment, but is in fact educational? And how can we sort of determine if entertainment is indeed educational?
I'm going to throw to Alicia to answer this first, but I've got something to say about this one too.
I might be stealing your words, Michael, but so to kind of start off, it's a really interesting thing, and we've had a lot of discussions around it because this concept of like edutainment, and it is this blurring, and edutainment serves a great purpose as well, and at the crux of the children's internet, it's about fun, and like educational things ought to be fun, and that's where that blurring takes place. But this is something a bit more, I don't want to say sinister because I think it's too harsh around it, but just what we're calling out is those instances where the types of digital products or services that are being labeled as educational, they might make claims that they've had educational experts consult on the development of this particular game. But when you actually dig into it, you can't, like, who they're pointing to, aren't alive anymore, or that, or they might be, I don't know, when you just kind of follow the breadcrumbs, it just kind of points to like, I'm not actually very convinced, or it's not very transparent who these educational experts were that consulted on, and thus the educational claims or outcomes that are being spruiked as why this particular, digital resource or app should be downloaded by a family. That's the thing that we're pointing to of when it becomes problematic, is when something is being labeled, but there isn't the evidence evidence behind it, so that as a consumer, I'm able, you know, as a you know, a person with a family would be able to read this and say, yes, this is an app that is saying that my child will have these particular learning outcomes after the end of finishing this game. That sounds great. But if there isn't any evidence behind it, that's when it becomes problematic, and that's what we're pointing to in that side of it. And less of course, there's going to be a blurring, but I guess we'd like to hope, or what we're aspiring within the types of principles and within this document is saying that if a game, you know, like educational games are great, and let's have educational games that are backed by evidence and demonstrate that these learning outcomes will be achieved through these particular gamified, you know, mechanics, these particular things. So those are my 2 cents. Michael, do you want to add?
I'm just going to add really super quickly, and we've got Dr. Christy Corser on the call as well, and just want to acknowledge that some of this is really very much based on work that Christy has done. So one of the things that we've noticed, for instance, is that in both the Apple Store and the Google Store, if you just search for, you know, reading app or literacy app, or if you search for mathematics app, that the results that are given to you just do not reflect the quality of the apps, right? So it's not as though the best or most educationally appropriate apps rise to the top and they're the ones that get suggested to you. The algorithms or the selecting methods or recommendation methods that these stores use are mostly based on, you know, the number of downloads or the popularity, and that just isn't necessarily an indicator of quality. So we know that there are some apps that families download that are just, for instance, for younger children, what we might call tap games or finger tracing games, which honestly don't have any kind of, you know, validity as necessarily being educational. The fact that you can tap numbers quickly or whatever doesn't mean that you're any more numerate than what you might have been 5 minutes before. So this is, you know, we're calling out how the big stores, and they are stores, right, how they make educational products available to families, and whether or not there's any kind of mechanism for ensuring that they are genuinely educational in a quality way. That's, you know, we would like to see all of that tightened up so that families and educators can make more confident decisions about the kinds of things they put in front of their kids.
No worries. Now, this is a question probably for all of you. One of the sort of suspected outcomes of the PISA report that's coming from OECD, which is expected to release tomorrow, many are thinking that the Australian students will be spending more time using digital devices as opposed to other countries. Does this make the issue more urgent and Australia at a more lucrative market to other tech companies?
Tama?
Sort of segue and just say that Australia is seen as a really useful test market by most American tech companies. So when, especially, and it's evident where, for example, when Instagram wanted to experiment with removing likes, they did that in Australia, but not in America. They didn't want to mess with their primary market, but Australia is a small and affluent enough market that messing with the settings of their apps in Australia is seen as something that will both reflect the sort of larger market, but will also not upset them in the same way. And so it's seen as quite an interesting test case of a smaller population. And I think the fact that we are relatively techie, relatively affluent in, you know, in these spaces means that it is seen as a useful microcosm. So it does mean that it's more and more important for us to have aspirational guidelines that do encourage students to make the most of these, being conscious that we are a relatively techie and relatively wired community.
Another suspected outcome of this PISA report, which is due to release tomorrow, says, well, many are suspecting that Australian kids in school are highly savvy with their devices, but not necessarily pursuing schoolwork or self-directed learning activities by using those devices. Are these tech skills engagements and are these tech skills and engagement not fitting into schools' frameworks around them? Why might that be if that's the case?
So, I mean, I think that it's really important to recognise that that we can identify digital skills according to genre to some extent, or according to sets of capabilities. And just because you develop a capability with one set of skills or abilities doesn't mean that that's necessarily transferable to a different set of skills. And this is why, for instance, it drives me to distraction when people use the term digital native, right? Which I think is actually a racist term anyway, but also in addition to that, makes this assumption that just because kids are using technology a lot, or that, you know, they're on devices a lot, that they necessarily have the skills that are transferable to other scenarios and for other purposes. And we just know that that's absolutely not the case. And so we see this in very clear examples where you might have a teenager who's very good on their phone with doing social media stuff and so on, but they wouldn't be able to, for instance, make a PowerPoint presentation on a PC. So it's just, you know, I think that it's really just really important to recognize that there are many different types of digital skills, and those that are needed for schooling or for office-based work, for instance, are quite different to the other kinds of skills we might develop in other parts of our lives. So we have to learn them and they have to be taught.
A question here for probably Alicia, actually. Look, games such as Roblox and Minecraft, as well as platforms such as YouTube Kids, are inherently made for the younger audiences. These types of games have a lot of content which is created by players, peers, and other users, user-generated content. However, often it's the case that there are some content that can slip through these sort of filters that, you know, essentially, if you were to upload a video to YouTube, for example, it says is an option which says, is this video made for kids? And nearly anyone can basically tick that and say, yes, this video is made for kids, which then may put it on the app for YouTube Kids. Same with, you know, Roblox. If a player makes a map or something, or a modification for Minecraft, they may not be suitable for these younger audiences. So how can we ensure that a children's internet remains foolproof to disallow this content, which isn't age appropriate?
Yeah, interesting question. So, and also a complex one in that, so right now, how, like, it's a really interesting example with for example, with the YouTube, like, is this for kids, you know, for children's content? And there's a lot of interesting things around that, just ticking that one button means for that creator in terms of being, you know, having that video being monetized or not, and with advertisers, and that's also a leverage or mechanism for incentivizing people to actually not tick that if it's not for children, because if they get caught as if it's not for children, then they get like a mark against their account, essentially. But what I want to say about when it comes to a better children's internet, when it comes to these types of things, it's also a question around age appropriateness, and not just using like 13 as a marker around that. And actually what we need to be calling for is having these quality standards for age appropriateness at all different kind of like ages and stages and different brackets for what that means. Because, for example, someone who might be 16 might create content on Roblox that, you know, is appropriate for maybe 14 and above, you know, but then someone who's 8 might be accessing it. And that becomes really tricky then when we're saying, well, it is made for children because it's a 16-year-old who's made it for a 14-year-old and they're both children. But yeah, like an 8-year-old might come along and also access those things. So what we're calling for is we need greater nuances, like, and accounting for, rather than having these kind of blanket ideas of like, is this for children, as in everyone who's like under 18 or under 13, and kind of accounting for the ways in which we have quality controls and consumer information at different like age brackets, and also allowing some flexibility within that, because let's say something might be marked as being age appropriate for an 11-year-old, but actually that 11-year-old might be at a stage in their life where they might be able to access things that a 13-year-old would be more appropriate for, because that's where that child is at. So just to kind of say, I think that this is the complexity of it, is that there isn't some switch that can be turned on and off to kind of mitigate all of these things. And I think that sometimes these discourses around protecting children online, people have this imaginary that it's like, well, there should be just a blanket rule, you know, like this is how we address this, when actually, no, it's much more nuanced. And I want to say that I think that this is the great thing about the internet, though, is that we do have the capabilities to actually address this in a more nuanced way as well. Like it's not impossible to I think it's kind of impossible to actually have a blanket thing, and we have the possibility to have a more nuanced approach to all different platforms to have age appropriate content. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, children being at always different stages in their developmental stages, essentially, a 11-year-old may be more developmentally advanced than some 14 or 15-year-olds sometimes. So, it's I understand to say the nuances behind that. The last question that I have today, and it's a bit of a can of worms, of course, it's about microtransactions. It's something that's evident in many games that are available today, particularly also ones for children. These microtransactions can be quite predatory. Is this something that needs to be closely regulated if we are going to be developing a children's internet?
I think this might be one for Tama.
Oh, look, I think microtransactions are really tricky, and it really does depend on context. I mean, I think in many households, the idea of any transactional account, any transaction taking place from an account that's marked as a children's account usually runs through parents anyway, which I think is a really good thing. But also there is a increasing concern that microtransactions in some spaces and in certain forms of games are modeled on gambling, for example. So there's some research that looks at things a bit like Candy Crush and says, okay, it's almost a gambling mechanism more than a play mechanism. And when there is you're stuck at this point and you can put 99 cents in and get to the next level, that can be quite problematic. I think there's a lot of research happening in this space at the moment, and I do think there are some problematic designs out there in play and game spaces that we need to be really mindful of and be quite cautious about. But at the same time, microtransactions in and of themselves are not harmful. It's the way that they're deployed in particular settings. So I wouldn't say, suddenly we need to do away with certain forms of microtransactions just because of the size of the amount being exchanged. It's about the context in which that might happen and the social and other drivers that are influencing whether that's something that we need to do now or not. And that it's also fair to say that the idea of kids learning, that commercial influences are one of the big drivers of the way that they'll be expected or thought to exchange, money for goods and services, whether they're digital or otherwise, is something that they need to learn and develop. But it needs to be done in a way that's perhaps slightly more careful than it is currently. So I wouldn't say that they're all bad, but that there are definitely spaces where there is a strong pressure that we need to be careful of, and certainly parents need to be mindful of if they're talking to young people about what's appropriate.
No worries. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for today, and that's all the questions that I've got to go through. So once again, I'd like to thank the three of you for coming along, Professor Michael Dezuani, Dr. Alicia Rodriguez, and Professor Tama Lever for coming along today for this Mistero webinar with the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child on what is the children's internet. We will be uploading this to our social media channels and YouTube channels. So if you'd like for a link, we can provide that to you. And other than that, I appreciate you all coming along. Thank you very much.